Well, I am so excited for this discussion today. I have two panelists who I not only admire, but I adore them. They are individuals I've known for a long time and people who I think share a similar passion to me about the topic of caregiving, but more relevant to the conversation today, the intersection of caregiving and mental health. And so this is a newer conversation. We talk a lot about caregiving here at Wealthy. This is a newer conversation for us, and so I'm really excited to dig into it. I want to go ahead and ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some stats just to lay the foundation for our discussion. And then I have a whole bunch of questions for the panelists, but please do put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll make sure we'll try to get to as many of those as we can as well. So by way of brief introduction on me, I'm Lindsay Juris-Rosner. I'm CEO, co-founder here at Wealthy. And Wealthy's mission is that we've set out to help families who are taking care of aging, chronically ill, or disabled loved ones. We talk about complex, chronic, and ongoing care at Wealthy. And that mission and vision is very personal to me. I was a caregiver myself for many years, took care of my mom, took care of my mother-in-law, my grandfather. I have kiddos, so I am technically in the sandwich generation, and so, I have experienced all of the intense emotions that come with caregiving, intense sadness and guilt and resentment, and all of the others that contribute to what we think, is kind of part of the issue here that we're going to discuss. So really excited for this discussion. I will do far less talking, I promise, once we get into the meat of the panel. But Liz O'Donnell, I want to hand it over to you and invite you to introduce yourself, share a little bit about your background, and if you're willing to share your caregiving story.
Sure. Thanks, Lindsay. So nice to be working with you. I am the founder of Working Daughter. It's a community for women balancing elder care and career. And our mission is twofold. One is make sure no one feels alone as they care for aging parents. And we do that through a really active Facebook community, our website, which has thousands of articles to support caregivers, and a membership program for those who really want more one-on-one and customized support. And our second goal is to make care and career compatible, because my experience was it hasn't been, but it could be. And so we work with employers to create support programs, and then we raise awareness for caregivers in the workplace. We have a National Working Daughters Day, which is going on year 3 in November, and we launched a Best Places to Work for Working Daughters program. And I came to this, like so many, through caregiving myself. I was working, high-stress job. I was the sole breadwinner in my family, and both of my parents were diagnosed with terminal illnesses on the same day. So working and caregiving to me was there are lots of difficult aspects of caregiving, but that was one of the hardest, was staying employed through my caregiving experience. And shortly after my dad died, he died after my mom, then my husband was diagnosed with cancer, and I cared for him for 15 months until he passed away. So I have to believe that this is, I'm meant to be here. This is less of a choice and more of a mission from who knows where. So I'm thrilled to be part of this convo.
Oh, thank you, Liz, for sharing. Dr. Kristen Tugman, we're so thrilled to have you as well. Will you share your background, and then also, if you're comfortable, sharing your connection to the caregiving topic?
Sure. So thank you for having me today. Again, I'm Kristen Tugman. I lead a team of folks called the Health and Productivity Analytics and Consulting Practice at Prudential. We really work with employers to help them really figure out ways to maximize productivity and minimize absence. And so we've definitely seen caregiving emerge as one of the top challenges for our HR professionals that we work with. Certainly, we found it to have an impact on productivity and ultimately an employer's bottom line. So we're, really trying to help employers understand why it makes sense to put caregiving solutions into the mix and make sure that they're compatible with other benefits like mental health, which also is a passion of mine. Just by way of background, I'm a rehab counselor by training, licensed professional counselor, and my PhD is in industrial and organizational psychology. So all that's to say, I'm really kind of a big geek for this stuff. I love the research. I love to dig into the data and really understand where we can make actionable change and produce results to create really mentally healthy workplaces. For me, caregiving has been sort of an emerging trend that I've seen in workplaces as I've kind of been immersed in mental health since the pandemic and a little bit pre-pandemic. Certainly, mental health in the workplace has always been an issue. I've been in this space for 21 years, or 25 years actually, and it's always been a conversation, but we found employers really start to take it seriously. But there's such a huge intersection with caregiving that it's becoming more and more of an important conversation. And then for me personally, very recently, actually, my mother was diagnosed with dementia that has really formed into full-fledged Alzheimer's over the last few years. And, it's been one of those things sort of on my periphery where I knew, there were caregiving needs and planning, and it felt manageable because my dad is caring for my mom. But I got an ominous text not too long ago that said, hey, I know you're coming to visit in a couple weeks. I need to talk to you. I'm not sure how much longer I can do this. Mm. And for me, that just made it so much more real. I experienced a sense of panic, like I have no idea really what to do. I have these conversations all the time with workplaces, but I don't know what to do. And frankly, I engaged Wealthy, reached out to Lindsay, and it's hard to describe the feeling of comfort and relief that I experienced by knowing somebody was going to be there to have my back. And I didn't even understand fully what it meant to have my back, but it has really further emphasized for me the importance of these types of programs for folks to one, manage their stress, manage their mental health, and ultimately feel like they're doing what they need to do for their loved ones. So again, really glad to be a part of this conversation because it's just so important.
So important. Thank you so much for sharing, Kristen. And yeah, thanks for leaning on us. And hopefully we can be supportive to you. I know it's a tough transition, tough moment. Let me transition here and move us into the dialogue that I'm excited for us to have. I want to start with laying the foundation with some statistics and giving us kind of a jumping off point here. It's really interesting to me because, for employers, I mean, Kristen, you kind of talked about this. Employers kind of talk about mental health over here, right? And caregiving over here and, other buckets. And yet, they're so intertwined. And we see that caregiving is a major root cause for, pretty significant mental health issues that folks in the workforce face. So just quickly, I'll rattle off some of these stats that I thought were pretty meaningful. First of all, it's 73% of workers who are facing some kind of caregiving responsibilities. That includes parents who have children, more typical needs, but also includes caregivers taking care of a loved one with more complicated care needs. So it's a significant portion of the workforce. And what we see is that caregiving can be incredibly stressful, emotional, time-consuming, and lonely for folks. We see that the burnout, the stress, the anxiety, the feelings of isolation, these things all just take a toll on our mental health. And so we see that caregivers are in a mental health crisis. We have a caregiving crisis in that we don't have enough care infrastructure to support the care needs that we have. And then on top of it, we see caregivers in a state of crisis. And, just to put this in terms of numbers, it's 57% of caregivers who experience clinically significant symptoms of anxiety or depression. And just to put that number in perspective, so 57% for caregivers, that's compared to roughly, call it 21% of the total population who experience clinically significant symptoms of anxiety or depression. So much higher incidence rate among caregivers. And then I think some of these other statistics, which I'll call on, just really quickly, 49% just experiencing total exhaustion. This is, mental, physical, emotional exhaustion, and 70% who put off addressing their own needs because of their caregiving duties. And that's a stat, I think, Kristen, from a recent Fidelity study. So that means that caregivers are struggling. They're, experiencing all these intense emotions. And on top of it, they're less likely to be able to put themselves first and reach out and seek the help that they may need. So that's the state of things, right? Given all those stats, given our moment in time, how are you feeling right now about the state of caregiving?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think, it's kind of one of those things that's, it's like something's got to give. It's extraordinarily complicated, but, and I've talked to many friends about this. It seems that, most dinner parties nowadays, the topic of how are you doing caring for your aging parents inevitably comes up, and it's the same conversation around, I don't know how people afford to put their loved ones in long-term care facilities when it's, upwards of $10,000 a month or $12,000 a month. We all have, Lindsay, you mentioned being a part of the sandwich generation, right? We spend our lives saving for our own retirement. We spend our lives saving for our kids' college education. But little did we know that our parents were probably going to exhaust their savings and not be in a position to pay for their own sort of long-term care. And I think that what is one of the things that worries me most is what are we going to do when folks are just saying, hey, I do okay for myself in terms of my financial income, but no one's prepared for that level of financial burden. And so what do we do? What do we do with folks that really need 24-hour care that can't get it? And so what happens is that falls back onto the family members to try to provide care that they may or may not be qualified to give, which then exacerbates stress, burnout, leads to mental health conditions. I'm not terribly optimistic. I just think there's a lot of work to be done. I am optimistic in the sense that we're having more of these conversations. There's more organizations like the two that we're highlighting today. So I think that's a good thing that we're highlighting the need and the conversation, but it's scary. And I think we just need to continue to talk about it and problem solve it. But I know I don't have the answer.
I think you bring up a great point, Kristen. The intersection of care and family finances is really challenging, right? And brings up a whole host of other kind of issues and stressors for families. Liz, tell us how you're feeling on this check-in question. How are you feeling about the state of caregiving right now?
Yeah, I love that you start with the check-in. I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, and the caution comes from the fact that we have such as we were just talking, we have such a long way to go in supporting caregivers and supporting working caregivers. And what concerns me are the callbacks to sort of pre-pandemic ways of working. Makes me feel like employers are not getting it, or they're not caring enough about supporting working caregivers. Maybe they're not grasping that I think every employee will be a caregiver in some way or form. And we had one woman in the working daughter community who was called back to work before she was really comfortable being around other people because she had a compromised parent at home. And when she got to the office, she was told to go into her office, shut the door, and then Zoom with her coworker sitting next to her. So, what's the point? Why couldn't she just stay at home? The caution also comes from what, Lindsay, you and I have talked about before. I feel like elder care is still treated like a parenthetical, both in HR policies and certainly in media stories. We still tend to talk mostly about working parents versus workers with parents. But the optimist part, throw the caution to the wind part, the optimist part is what you were just saying, that the conversation has increased, and that I think the pandemic drove awareness that we're all caring, that we all have messy lives. I think people now, because of the pandemic, are more motivated to ask for what they need, have a different way of framing work-life challenges, and that there are a lot of great thinkers and innovators looking at this. But the infrastructure piece that you just mentioned and the shortage of professional caregivers, This is still a kitchen table conversation when it really has to be kitchen table, boardroom, and policy conversation, because if we don't have the paid caregivers, or if the paid caregivers aren't well cared for themselves, then it all falls to family.
Oh, super well said, and couldn't agree more. And Liz, I'm going to switch gears for a second and actually dig in a little bit kind of on the personal side, because I want to paint a picture for folks, just to connect kind of the two topics of caregiving and mental health, and maybe just ask you to share, a little bit more about your personal caregiving experience as you were caring for your mom and dad and then your husband. What were some of the things that contributed to kind of the mental health for you, and what have you seen through the working daughter community with other caregivers?
Well, I think so many of the factors that contribute to mental health challenges are present in caregiving. Trauma is certainly one of them. So many of us enter caregiving through a crisis scenario. We witness, things in the ER. We witness sirens and flashing red lights and medical teams, and those are very traumatic experiences, and there's really nowhere to process them. We're not going to talk about them with our colleagues. We might not even talk about them with friends and family who haven't yet been through the experience, although I agree the dinner conversations are changing finally. So what do you do with that trauma that you've experienced? And I hear a lot of talk about PTS in the working daughter community, even after caregiving has ended. There's the loneliness, the social isolation, right? We know as caregivers, we know two things, right? People are always saying you need to take care of yourself and you need a support system. We know that, but we can't figure out how to get it. We can't make plans. We're canceling on people all the time. We lose friends and family who don't understand. We're worried about telling our managers. I know for me, I was, senior level on the leadership team, but still tried to keep what was happening from my coworkers and my boss, because two things. One was I didn't want to appear like a weak link. I had always been a super achiever at work, so that's very unsettling. And the other reason was, nobody else understood, or they were going to tell me to take leave, and I couldn't afford to take leave. So we keep a lot of this to ourselves. The long-term stress, right? So many of us are doing medical tasks and really feel like we're managing life or death. Like we really get this, almost godlike complex trying to care for somebody that we love. And we're so worried about making a mistake. That's incredible stress. And I don't know that people realize how much medical care happens in the home from unpaid, untrained, non-professionals. And then the other two that I don't think we talk about enough, grief. I think grief is a huge factor in caregiving that people don't necessarily realize happens well before somebody passes away. Every change in our parents' skill level, ability, every change to our way of life, that's grief. We're grieving. And then there's, of course, anticipatory grief. And I mean, we're really bad at talking about grief in this country. We're compared to the way we talk about grief, we're well advanced when it comes to caregiving, right? So I don't know that people recognize how much grief is happening. And then the last part I would just say is it's a major identity shift, especially for adult children. When you start to care for a parent who maybe cared for you, you don't have that safety net that you always expected. And so who are you as you're looking at your own adulthood, right? And your own, when you look at aging up close, you look at your own aging up close. So those are just some of the things that I experienced, that I hear about in Working Daughter, that I think contribute to the mental health stress.
Liz, that was so well said, and I think your trauma point is so fascinating. I can share personally, experiencing, through therapy, really kind of surfacing some of those more kind of traumatic moments for me through my caregiving journey. And then the PTS point is really interesting. I was a longtime caregiver and then had a child of my own, and it was fascinating. Changing a diaper, simple, right? Mm-hmm. Changing a diaper for my little baby was kind of triggering for me, right? And there were little moments like that where I felt, there's this human that's fully dependent on me, and that should have been a very beautiful thing. And instead, for me, it really did kind of bring up some complicated emotions. So Thank you for sharing. I loved all those points. And Kristen, I would love your perspective on the same question. How do you think about caregiving and mental health? What are some of the challenges you see at play?
Yeah, Liz, I thought Liz brought up a lot of really great points that really resonated. So when I think about, how do we create sort of a comprehensive caregiving solution, it does make me think that we need sort of this multidisciplinary team that does focus on specifically the mental health of the caregiver. Because I always say half the battle is self-awareness, but most people don't have that level of self-awareness. I honestly, I joke that I provide myself with therapy all the time because I am a trained therapist. And so I do really focus every single day on my own self-awareness around what's happening for me. Why am I feeling what I'm feeling? What are those feelings that put me at risk? And most people don't have that ability or that luxury of that level of education. And so trauma is very real. And if we don't address trauma initially and throughout, I think, the caregiving journey, we are all at risk of a post-traumatic stress reaction because ultimately our brains do what they need to do to protect us. And so they put us in a state of survival mode. And so basically what happens is your brain does not process the trauma that you've experienced, and it sort of gets stuck. And so, Lindsay, you talked about changing your child's diaper as a trigger, and that's exactly what happens. Those memories get stuck, and then suddenly you're not functioning in a way that you thought you could, and you're not sure why. And so I think it is really important to create a treatment team that at least can educate folks about what they might be at risk for. I think the grief piece of it is extraordinarily important as well. We're all at risk for complicated grief, as we don't process. And again, as our brains are very sophisticated and they will protect us. But we've got to be able to take a step back and recognize when we're experiencing those different stages of grief because they can also get stuck. I remember, I can think about all of the different stages that I've gone through with my mom, where, you get to a place where you recognize, oh, this is not going to go in the direction that's going to, this is going to be really hard. And then you get to the place where you realize this is not really the woman who raised me. And then you get to a place where you realize, wow, I don't think she can really function on her own. And so it's like every stage that you get to, you think maybe this is the end of it, but then there's something else at play that leads to continued exacerbation of grief. So, I think there's an opportunity for, at the very least, for self-awareness education. But I also think at best, there's an opportunity for a multidisciplinary approach that does care for the caregiver throughout each stage in the process to ensure that mental health has the best chance at remaining intact.
Love that. I love the guidance around practicing the kind of daily self-awareness about what you're feeling. And you bring up a great point too, Kristen, about the sort of, kind of these next stages that are a little bit hard to predict and kind of, you're having to kind of react to these new realities really in real time as the kind of caregiving continues. Liz, in our prep session, I'll call both of us out. In our prep session, we talked about, I think we're all probably big champions of therapy and seeking out, support and mental health support. But there are some challenges with therapy. I shared my challenge with therapy, which is just, I found through caregiving, and I find this, by the way, still in my life, right? Like, I don't have time. I don't have time for therapy. I would love to be in therapy right now. I think that would be useful. I work, I have my family, right? That's the extent of things. Liz, what are your thoughts on kind of, therapy and the reality of leveraging therapy for most caregivers?
Yeah, I don't think I possess half of the self-awareness, Kristen, that you talked about, but I am aware enough to know my personality type under stress, and I can be a real bear to be around. I get hyper-focused on the logistics and get out of my way. So my concern when my two different caregiving experiences started, one my parents and then my husband, was I really wanted to go through these experiences with grace and not, alienate my husband and children and people who were, meant well and trying to help me. So I sought out therapy both times, and that was really my goal. My goal was help me go through this with some grace. And I found therapy to be incredibly helpful. And I also found both practitioners to be incredibly accommodating about my schedule and knowing my situation and the need to cancel. But as accommodating as they were and as flexible as they were, at some point, it just became so burdensome for me to have to remember to call and cancel or call and reschedule. And they would be so wonderful and nice and say, okay, well, what can you do next week? Well, I can't do next week because I did this week and I have work and I have soccer games with the kids, and it just doesn't fit. And so, I think I got some real benefit, and I probably would have gotten way more benefit if I stayed, but eventually I just couldn't take the logistics piece of it and the one more thing to manage.
Mm-hmm. And Kristen, I guess I'll turn to you on the next question, which is related. What are traditional mental health benefits missing when it comes to supporting caregiving employees? What do you see that these employees need, and how can we take that more holistic approach that you were talking about?
Yeah, I think to Liz's point, they need, we need flexibility. And so, traditional therapy has always been in person, and we have at least seen a shift as COVID restricted in-person therapy. We did see the American Psychological Association come out immediately and make sure that they put whatever they could in place to create the confidentiality arrangement needed to move to teletherapy. We've seen a huge push to digital therapy and in creating that level of flexibility. So I think we have to continue to evolve and grow the ability to have video therapy and digital therapy. And even we, as practitioners, have seen some benefit to video therapy, actually, because once a week or once every couple of weeks, folks can kind of get themselves together to get into the office and look presentable. Sometimes we get more information if we can see somebody on video a little more regularly and kind of see the surroundings and kind of see how they're put together. So it gives us a little more information to kind of understand how folks are really, really functioning. So that's been an added benefit. I think it does come down to, though, the therapists and the counseling industry to really think about caregiving as a particular stressor and a particular sort of treatment need versus, just sort of getting to a place where we're just worried about, traditional cognitive behavioral therapy or talk therapy. So I think, we do have an opportunity in the industry to really take a look at caregiving and try to understand, what are the therapeutic needs that are associated with it? What do most caregivers experience, like to Liz's point, trauma and grief, and to make sure that we can ask the right questions and put the right treatment plan together. But I think, it is flexibility, but at the same time, too, I think when we think about caregiving services, we do have to emphasize self-care, because we can always make an excuse to not take care of ourselves, that we have the next thing that we have to get to for someone else. But it does come down to making sure that you put the oxygen mask on yourself before you care for somebody else, because if you get burned out and your self-care suffers, you're not going to be as effective caring for somebody else. So I think we've just got to continue to emphasize that. We've got to prioritize ourselves first, and that's not selfish. It's important, and it's vital in our ability to care for somebody else.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to do we talked about some of the kind of, trade-offs with therapy and how to think about kind of supporting caregivers. I'm going to get really specific, and we'll do like a quick lightning round with current solutions. By the way, I'll just say it's still fascinating to me that I still hear sometimes from employers, who say, yeah, we've got caregiving covered. We have backup care. We have an EAP. We're good. And unfortunately, my belief is there is no single solution that's going to help all caregivers, right? Like I think, and even, right, speaking from Wealthy can provide certainly a ton of support. But there are great solutions in the market. And I think it's a little bit of a portfolio approach, right? With a multi-pronged solution. So we're going to do a quick speed round and talk about pros and cons of sort of existing solutions that we see in the market right now. I'll kind of rattle through a few of these. So we'll start off, Liz, with you, mental health support, quick pros and cons of employers offering mental health support.
Well, I think you both already touched on it. Lindsay, you talked about it has to be a portfolio. So mental health support has to be on the table. And what Kristen said, there's no magic pill. People also have to be willing to do some work. And that's the challenge there.
Kristen, pros and cons really quickly on mental health support for caregiving employees?
I mean, I think, there's definitely an added focus among employers, and there's more benefits that exist. I think the con with depending on it is there's not an emphasis on caregiving and the ramifications to mental health.
Okay, moving on to the next solution we see some employers offering, caregiving leave. Kristen, I'll start with you. Pros and cons of caregiving leave.
And I think
it's a topic you care a lot about.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's good to provide that level of flexibility, but I think if we just depend on leave, it creates a tension at work where somebody is covering for somebody and it feels like the person's attendance is unpredictable. I think that we need to think about it more comprehensively. What is the actual need, and is there a way to accommodate, just like we would accommodate a disabling condition? Can we create a stay-at-work opportunity? What's the true need for the individual, and how do we help them maintain their productivity in some creative way versus just depending on, you just go out and take your leave.
Great. What is pros and cons of caregiving leave?
Well, I'm going to assume we're talking about paid, and I think the pro is that it gives people the space to make really difficult choices. Too many times I hear people with these false choices of I need to be with somebody in their time of need and I can't not be at work. So that to me is a pro, that it gives them space. The con, I think, is when do you take leave? Do you take leave when you get the call, when they're in the hospital, when they're coming out, when they're in rehab? I mean, so I think we toss leave around as this panacea. Well, if we had paid leave, caregivers would be okay. When do you take it?
Great point. Let me ask about EAPs, Liz. Pros and cons of EAP support.
I think the pros are that if we spend some time looking into our EAPs at work, there's great stuff there. The cons are there just seems to be a low trust of EAPs that it's going to be recorded, it's going to call me out, my employer is going to know what I'm up to, I just don't want to use it. So I think it needs a rebranding.
Great point. Kristen, pros and cons of EAP support for caregivers?
Yeah, I would agree that the branding, it definitely needs some branding work. But I've also found that, there's a shortage of therapists, and EAPs have not been spared. And so we do find significant waiting lists, even with a traditional EAP. So I think that's a significant con where folks think, I'm going to call the EAP, I'm going to get what I need, but ultimately they're still waiting weeks for services.
Next one is caregiver PTO. Kristen, I'll start with you. Pros and cons of caregiver PTO, which, by the way, is a newer trend. We offer it now at Wealthy. These are dedicated days that can be used as full days or chunks of a day, expressly for caregiving needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does create a level of flexibility. I like the idea of it in the sense that it starts to normalize caregiving. Where you can say, you really set aside a specific amount of hours or days to dedicate to caregiving. So I think it will do a little bit to reduce stigma. But again, it kind of harkens back to the leave principle, which is just because we have a couple of days to take away from work doesn't mean that it solves everything. So again, it comes down to the comprehensive solution in the end.
Great. Liz, caregiver PTO, your thoughts, pros and cons?
I would add to what Kristen said, and I agree with everything she said, that I think layered on top of that would be some training on how to use that caregiver time off. I was just talking to somebody yesterday, and they said the best time off they used was when they used those days to prepare for the long term. So not necessarily just to be in a crisis or solving an immediate problem, but thinking about getting their Medicaid paperwork, researching long-term care living situations. And so if we layer in some training about how to maximize that time, it can really pay off.
Love that. I'll share my 2 cents, by the way. I like caregiver PTO because we found that our caregiving employees were using their PTO for caregiving. And we wanted to say, no, PTO, we want you to use PTO to rejuvenate, to relax, to go on vacation. And we want to give you separate days that are dedicated for caregiving. So not taking away any of the PTO or vacation days. So it's been an experiment, and I'll keep you all posted.
It's like coming back from maternity leave and having your coworkers ask how your vacation was, right?
Right. That's right. You're like, yeah, not really. The next one is caregiving concierges. So certainly Wealthy is in that category. We have a number of other companies, pros and cons. Liz, I'll start with you on caregiving concierge.
I'm going to sound like a suck-up now, Lindsay, but I'm just such a huge fan because I think one of the great benefits that concierge services offer is the eliminating the overwhelm, right? I don't think there's a shortage of resources for caregivers. There's a shortage of brain power to sort through the resources. So I don't have a con.
Kristen, caregiving concierges, pros and cons for you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it does alleviate the overwhelm. It's really just about the education piece of it and making sure that your workforce understands how and when to use it and that it exists and that it's confidential. But yeah, I don't, in general, see a con. It's really about engagement and adoption.
Kristen, I'll turn to you next, although, Liz, I know you have strong opinions on this next one. Manager trainings, pros and cons of getting managers comfortable talking about caregiving with employees.
It's funny, I'm doing a ton of manager trainings right now on, we call them manager sensitivity trainings on mental health. And the managers find them extremely useful, but then it becomes a burden for them to come to another training. So I would say make sure that they're comprehensive in terms of, address mental health, address caregiving, address just the need to know your employees well enough to have a conversation with them about what's really going on and what's impacting performance. So I don't see a con. There's a practicality to it to make sure that you get managers to engage and listen and find it useful.
Awesome. Please share your pros and cons on manager trainings.
Well, I'm a huge fan, as you know, about anything we can do to make the workforce the workplace more compassionate. And I've seen a lot of breakdowns where there are great HR policies around caregiving, but managers then go rogue and don't have that compassion. I think the con is, the manager burden, as we talked about, and the more we can generalize how we train managers to address any personal situation in a compassionate way is better than these specific trainings that the managers might not be able to take on, the workload from. General compassion, I think, is what we lack.
Fair enough. Last one here. I'm going to make sure we get to some of the questions that we're getting. We're getting some good questions in the Q&A. So final one for our speed round, lightning round, is the solution of senior leadership kind of storytelling, vulnerability. Liz, I'll start with you, pros and cons of that.
Yeah, I think anything we can do to make people more aware that caregiving exists is a good thing, and modeling from leadership, from senior leadership is always a good thing. The con I see is that I think we're moving into this place where in order for people to enact the support they need at work, they're expected to throw it all out on the table and tell everybody, I'm a caregiver, my mother is sick, I have mental health issues. And so I support the leadership team, sharing and modeling, and I don't want to make it that we have to really bare our souls to get the support we need. Some people just want basic privacy, right?
Great point. Kristen, your thoughts on leadership storytelling and vulnerability?
Yeah, I think that is a great point. But yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of leadership sharing vulnerability because it creates empathic leadership and creates, sort of a culture of inclusion. So anytime, I always encourage senior leadership to tell their story, be it from a caregiving or mental health perspective, because that is what's going to normalize caregiving needs and mental health needs in the workplace and make it okay to raise your hand that you need something. So I don't see a ton of much around it, as long as that leader is authentic and truly vulnerable.
So we know mental health has been top of mind for employers for a few years now. I've been personally thrilled to see mental health become, more destigmatized, more mainstream, probably in part due to some celebrities, sharing their stories and making it feel normal. So how do we get caregiving to that same place? Kristen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do think caregiving can learn a little bit from mental health. And I think there's a good conversation to be had around the intersection between mental health and caregiving. But, we look at the kind of these three tenets, which is raising awareness, reducing stigma, and improving access to care. So I think, these are pillars that caregiving can use as well. It's really about educating the workforce to, understand that these are not uncommon issues, that it's okay, that all of us are at risk. And then what do you do? And educating folks about what steps they can take, how they can take care of themselves, but then creating the ability to have services like a wealthy, a concierge service, so they know where to turn. And that, it does create that level of access to care, but, accompany it with self-awareness education. The workforce is changing, and so we all, we have to move toward, Liz, to your point, a compassionate workplace if we're going to keep our employees. It does come down to retention and creating a mentally healthy workplace comprehensively so that we have engaged, productive, loyal employees. The Great Resignation is a real thing, and people have reprioritized their lives at post-pandemic, and so it's more and more important for employers to meet employees where they are in their needs, and caregiving is a big piece of that.
Great point. Liz, I want to get your thoughts on the same question. How do we destigmatize? How do we normalize caregiving? How do we learn from the mental health space?
Well, I wonder if there's a space for caregiving in the inclusion conversations that we're having. Certainly not to take away from the important diversity work that so many companies are doing, but I think caregiving is so much a part of people's identities sometimes. And I know, the workshops that I've been to, especially in the first couple of years after my husband died, I identified more as widow or as single mother of teens, just trying to get through life, than I did as cisgendered, white, middle class, whatever it might be. And so I think there's some space there for companies to understand that what we have going on at home is a huge part of how we show up and who we show up as.
So we're running out of time, and I do have a question that was not discussed in our prep that I'm just sitting here thinking about, which is, listen, we're in a current environment that is, current economic environment that's challenging, and there's some uncertainty and unknown about, where we'll go with a potential recession, and we're seeing companies lay off employees. How does caregiving, we talked about this. I love your point, Liz, about, that caregiving is an inclusion, topic. And Kristen, your point about this, about retention. How do employers think about, doing more around caregiving? Like, is caregiving a nice to have right now in this economic environment? Is it a need to have? How should employers think about it, given kind of our macro environment? And maybe Liz, I'll start with you.
This might be a fantasy, but I truly believe, and I will continue to beat this drum, that I think caregivers are some of the best employees you can hire. When you think about their skill set, the negotiation skills, the financial, the attention to detail, the work ethic, I think if we can shift the thinking around caregiving employees as burdens and think about them as amazing, then maybe that helps I worry about these conversations when we talk about all the stresses of caregivers, that they are going to be marginalized in the workplace. And so, like I said, it might be a fantasy, but I'm going to continue to push the conversation to what an amazing workforce. And why don't you have a caregiver leading every future of work panel that's going on? Because they're already living the future of work. So that's my fantasy.
I love it. Kristen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think this economic downturn is interesting because there's still a labor shortage. So if you look at the labor market right now, there's 2 openings per every worker looking for a job. So as much as employers might be thinking about a recession, interest rates are going up, which does bode well for corporations, and they need employees. I still think that there's a huge retention play here. And so there's this point of, caregivers are, they're disciplined and they are dedicated to their family and their work typically. But I think, caregiving is only going to increase. I lost an employee during the pandemic. We are living in uncertain times. We don't know really what's going to happen with the pandemic. We know that there's workers that are sandwiched. So my employee felt like she wasn't giving enough to her child who was at home. And so she said to me, I have to leave my dream job. And so that's the reality I think that we're all still facing. Again, I think I've mentioned it before, but I think the Great Resignation is a real thing. And we need to make sure that we're maintaining the productivity of all of our workers as best we can. I do think in an ideal world, we think about caregiving just as we think about disability and return to work and stay at work, and that we do really understand what are your needs, and we treat them, I would say we treat them similar to restrictions and limitations, right? So I have to be at my mom's house at 3 o'clock for the next 3 months because of X, Y, and Z. Okay, can we accommodate that for a short period of time in order to maintain your productivity and your employment because you are a valued employee? And those are the conversations I think we need to have. How do we preserve the productivity of our caregivers? Because we don't have the luxury of just deciding because somebody has some barriers and obstacles that we can allow them to exit the workforce.
Great points. I'll add my 2 cents, which is I had a very fascinating conversation with Corey Berry, who's the current CEO of Best Buy, and she's phenomenal. And we have the honor of being able to count Best Buy as a client. And I asked her, how does she think about caregiving support, even, in this current economic environment? And she said, for Best Buy, even if Best Buy has to lay people off, she thinks about, in her mind, if she makes layoffs, she's going to have to take a portion of the amount of money saved on those layoffs and reinvest them back into retaining the workers she does have. And I had never thought about it before, but it's so true. Layoffs are so unsettling, and these economic times are so unsettling. And so there's sort of additional investment, to your point, Kristen, that's required to retain and support the workers you do want to keep. And then she went on to say she sees caregiving support as just core infrastructure. It's part of the scaffolding that employees need to be able to show up to work and be their best selves and be productive. And so I just found that really, really helpful, really eye-opening. All right, we do have some great questions I want to get to. So the first question we got in the chat, in the Q&A, is, can you address the impact on children who provide elder care too? It's interesting, this term I've never heard. My son is a sky blossom. I don't know what that is. And I worry about him too. Kristen, maybe I'll start with you. Thoughts on the impact on children who provide elder care support?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, it's funny. I think back to my own childhood, and I was asked to care for my grandmother when I was 12, and because my parents needed to go out to dinner, and that was pretty daunting. When you think about having Liz, to your point earlier, having somebody's sort of life in your hands, and she, was somewhat mobile, but she had Alzheimer's as well. So that to me was a bit traumatic, honestly, and I remember it like it was yesterday. So from a mental health perspective, what I would say is we've got to just make sure that, those children that are putting themselves in that position, even if they're volunteering, that we're giving them the support that they need, that we're debriefing with them and having conversations and trying to understand what is it that they're trying to process, because I promise they're trying to process something. And if they're not trying to process it, it's probably getting stuck and it's going to create some trauma later. So we've got to provide some very clear support system around those individuals.
Thank you. Liz, your thoughts on children involved in caring, in elder care support?
Yeah, I agree with what Kristen said from the trauma piece, because it's an out of order experience, right? We're not thinking as children that we're going to be caring for somebody older than us. We expect to be cared for. That's how we're conditioned. So watching the trauma piece, I think, is important. From an optimistic standpoint, I would add, though, as adults who may, witness a child in that situation, let's also remember there are, and this is not to minimize the stress of caregiving, but there are incredible benefits post-caregiving too. And there's research that I'm really excited about called the Caregivers Gain. And it talks about that caregivers compared to non have higher self-esteem, cognitive abilities, physical strengths, and I think that comes from being available to somebody in such an intimate, all-in kind of way. So there's trauma and there's upside.
Love it. I'll share with you both. It's interesting. I was chatting with one of our investors recently who said, Lindsay, how are you feeling as a founder? These are really stressful times, testing the resolve of a lot of our portfolio CEOs and founders. How are you feeling? And I thought to myself, this is nothing, right? Compared to some of the more challenging kind of moments in my caregiving throughout my kind of experience as a caregiver, especially for my mom. I guess I really, to your point, Liz, I've really built that grit that helps me kind of push through more challenging times. So it really has kind of conditioned me differently, if you will. We have one more question here that I want to sneak in before we run out of time. The question is, should this be within the general employee assistance programs, or is there some stigma attached to this part of HR? I don't know if, Liz, you're comfortable jumping in there. It's a good question.
I think it's a yes and. As you said, it's a portfolio approach. I also think the approach has to be pulled through the entire organization. So training managers to be compassionate, offering benefits through EAP, through, concierge services, modeling from senior leadership. Yes, and everywhere else too.
Kristen, your thoughts on where these types of programs live?
Yeah, I would agree with it. I like the idea of having it sort of outside of the EAP, because I think, again, EAP is trying to be a lot of things to a lot of people. And if we can specialize in this particular area, I think you're going to get more engagement and more benefit. And it gives you an opportunity to educate employees more effectively so that they do, in fact, engage.
I'll add my 2 cents, which is I've been observing this recently. There are teams of people within companies focused on attracting talent. There are teams of people within companies focused on benefits for talent. We don't often see kind of people focused on retention, right? And that's where caregiving benefits should probably live. So maybe that's a future, we see some companies setting up employee experience teams. I think that's sort of an interesting place for some of these benefits to live. But yeah, it's, this is about attracting caregivers. This is about retaining caregivers, and then making sure that we're allowing folks to, be productive, which is probably about the benefits portfolio. So not a simple answer. I want to make sure we close here by giving Chris and Liz just a final word. Anything you'd like to close on for our joiners here today? Anything we didn't ask, or anything else that's just kind of floating around in your brain as we wrap up? Kristen, I'll start with you.
Sure. I would just say one thing we didn't think about is sort of how corporate America really needs to adjust to this sort of new world, which is, we're going to continue to have caregiving needs. We're also going to continue to have more generous leave policies. And I think corporate America has gotten into, over the years, so much of a habit of being lean that one of the things that could benefit our workforce is if we actually staffed up relative to the amount of leave that folks are able to take, so that we don't, in our workforces, have to panic when somebody needs a caregiving leave or when somebody goes out on maternity leave. I think that will create a much healthier workplace, increased productivity, and increased retention, so that things like needing a mental health day or needing a mental health leave or needing a caregiver leave won't have so much stigma attached to it, and people will enjoy the flexibility that, these new sort of policies that are emerging afford them without feeling bad that their coworkers are, covering for them and more overworked than they were when they were fully staffed, or they thought they were fully staffed. So I think that's just an important consideration. It doesn't make me super popular when I talk to corporate America, but I think it's an adjustment we're going to have to make in order to keep employees engaged.
Well, it's a brilliant point, right? Like even if you increase leave by a couple weeks, right? Modeling that out, right? Let's scenario plan for what that looks like as employees actually utilize that, and what's the impact that's going to have on productivity and the ability to still get the work done. Liz, I'll close with you here. What are your thoughts? Final thoughts? Anything we didn't touch on?
Yeah, before I get there, I'm really excited about what you just said too, Kristen, because there's leave, then there's strain on the people behind the office, which need for leave. Yeah, fascinating to think about that. I would say one of the things that I'd like to see corporate America get better at is set up the parameters for flex, set up the parameters for companies, for employees to take the time and the care that they need, and then get out of the way. So set the expectations about how people can take leave, what's expected of them, how they should communicate it, how they should cover, when they're expected to report back in, and then sort of get out of everybody's business in a sense, so that we can feel more free to say, taking Wednesday as a mental health day, I'm taking Tuesday for my mom, and not have to sort of overshare and feel stigmatized. But what are the parameters? What do we expect from employees? And then trust them to do it.
Love that. Well, great point to close on. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and especially to you, Liz, and to you, Kristen. Thank you for the great discussion. And I think we're all easy to track down on LinkedIn, but if folks have additional questions, they can certainly funnel those through our team here at Wealthy or directly to both of you. So thank you to both of you. Thanks to everybody for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.